Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, so that means it's time for another video. Last week I gave my picks for the most common misconceptions about the Middle Ages, and I finished it up by talking about the misconception that Jews were constantly persecuted by everybody throughout the Middle Ages. And as I promised at the end of that video, that's the topic we're talking about today. Now, I do want to stress that I'm not saying anti-Semitism and persecution didn't happen to Jews in the Middle Ages. It absolutely did, especially in the later Middle Ages when fantastical accusations against Jews emerged, like charges of ritual murder, blood libel, host desecration, and well poisoning. These new accusations did result in increasing violence and persecution of Jews living in medieval Western Christendom. There's no debating that. And if you want to know more about that side of things, I do have a video on this channel that focuses on medieval anti-Semitism that might interest you. In this video, though, we're going to temper that knowledge we have of Jews being persecuted with the fact that medieval Jews and Christians typically had peaceful and even friendly relationships with one another. When instances of violence and persecution of Jews occurred during the Middle Ages, it usually was interrupting a norm where medieval Jews and Christians were getting along. So while the anti-Semitism video really looked at the dark side of medieval Jewish-Christian relations, this video focuses on what was normal in medieval Jewish-Christian relations instead of those brief periods of violence and persecution. In particular, I'm going to talk about three main areas that complicate any sort of idea that medieval Jews and Christians hated one another and just couldn't get along. In particular, I'm going to look at three topics that complicate any sort of idea that medieval Jews and Christians hated one another and could never get along. The three things I'm focusing on here are, first, a charter that the Prince Bishop of Spire used to entice Jews to settle in his city. Second, we'll look at several cases of Jews and Christians who were hired as artists and craftsmen for people of the other faith. And third, we'll look at some close relationships that medieval Jewish and Christian women fostered with one another throughout the Middle Ages. So let's look at that first topic, where we'll be talking about a charter given to the Jews of Spire. It was offered in 1084 by a man named Rudiger, who was the Prince Bishop of Spire. Prince Bishop might sound a little strange to us today, but it was common within the Holy Roman Empire, and it indicated that these bishops were both religious leaders as well as feudal overlords. In other words, Rudiger had a ton of power in both the religious and secular worlds. So let's take a look at this charter that Rudiger wrote. Rather than read this document in its entirety all at once, I'm breaking it into excerpts so that I can discuss each segment of this charter. First, let's start with the introduction. In this introduction, Rudiger is explaining why this charter is being written, and he writes, "When I wished to make a city out of my village of Spire, I, Rudiger, Prince Bishop of Spire, thought that the glory of our town would be augmented 1,000-fold if I were to bring Jews. I have accorded them the following provisions." So it's quite notable here that Rudiger believes bringing Jews to his town will turn Spire into a city, even noting the presence of Jews would augment the city 1,000-fold. While in no doubt that's a bit of hyperbolic flowery language, it makes sense that Rudiger believes bringing Jews to Spire would make the city a better place in many ways. Jews were very important for Europe economically, providing two major services in this part of the Middle Ages. First, they often operated as moneylenders. This was something that was a result of persecution, at least in part. Jews in most parts of Europe could not own land, nor could they get involved in crafts because they weren't allowed to join guilds. Meanwhile, it was forbidden for Christians to lend money at interest to other Christians. So Jews had a limited number of professions they could pursue, and money lending was one that Christians weren't allowed to do. So the niche there was pretty obvious. Importantly, Jewish moneylenders helped create a credit economy in medieval European cities. The second major economic service Jews offered was as Europe's premier long-distance merchants. Because of their status as an accepted minority in both the Christian and Muslim worlds, it was much easier for Jews to travel between the two. There was basically a network of Jews throughout the Islamic and Christian worlds that worked as a trade route, bringing goods from the Islamic world into the Christian world and vice versa. This was a role that largely evaporated in the wake of the Crusades when Christians, especially Italians, got more involved in this type of trade, but we're talking about 1084 here, so we're looking at the tail end of Jews being the primary international merchants in medieval European society. As we get into the various provisions that Rudiger grants to Jews, you'll see that he's doing everything he can to help stimulate economic Jewish activity in his city. In short, Rudiger thought Jews would make Spire a better place, and that isn't the sentiment of a world that sees Jews only in a negative light. Now, let's look at two of the provisions from the charter that are clearly meant to help stimulate Spire economically. Rudiger writes, I've accorded them the free right of exchanging gold and silver, and of buying and selling everything they use, both within their residential area and outside, beyond the gate, down to the wharf, and on the wharf itself. I have given them the same right throughout the entire city. I have also added that if a Jew from elsewhere has quartered with them, he shall pay no toll. So here, the Jews are extended two privileges. First, unlike other residents of Spire, Jews don't have to pay anything to exchange gold and silver, a tax other residents would have to pay. He also makes it clear that Jews can go wherever they want and do whatever business they need to do in Spire. It's also important to note here that Rudiger does refer to, quote, their residential area, end quote. One of the other provisions of this charter that we're not diving super deep into is that Jews get their own part of town. This might make you think of ghettos, but those don't actually emerge until well after the Middle Ages are over. That's another Renaissance thing that often gets blamed on the Middle Ages, but it actually comes much later. Jews in many cities lived in specific quarters by their own choice. This made it easier for various religious observances. So that's what he's referring to here, not a ghetto. A ghetto is substantially different as it's sort of a legal part of town where Jews can live and they're not allowed to live anywhere else, and this is substantially different. The other right Jews are granted here may not seem quite as obvious as being economically motivated. Jews are allowed to have fellow Jews from elsewhere stay with them, and they don't have to pay a quartering tax, something the non-Jewish residents of Spire had to do. This is a nice privilege for Jews, as it means having visitors is easier. But it also means that if Jews are traveling and doing business, as they often were at the time, they will be more interested in staying in the city and offering their wares to its residences if they aren't forced to pay a lodging tax. In other words, this is here to attract traveling Jewish merchants. Alright, now let's look at another excerpt. This one is about how the Jews in the city are governed and how law works for them. Rudiger writes, just as the mayor of the city serves among the burghers, so too shall the Jewish leader adjudicate any quarrel which might arise among them or against them. If he shall be unable to determine the issue, then the case shall come before the bishop of the city or his chamberlain. So in short, there's a mayor of sorts for the Jews of Mainz, and it is his job to deal with any crimes or other problems that arise among them or against them. That last part is important because it gave this Jewish leader the authority to deal with crimes committed against Jews by the Christian residents of the city. This provision does, of course, also say that the bishop, who is Rudiger himself, has the supreme authority and will rule on the issues where the Jewish leader isn't sure what to do, and one can also imagine that if things are controversial, the bishop will step in and make his own ruling. Now, let's look at another excerpt. This time we're seeing what I think are the two most fascinating provisions of this charter, because they're designed to waive some of the limitations that had been placed on the Jewish community by the church itself. Remember, Rudiger is a high-ranking person in the church, and yet he decides to waive a number of things that he was supposed to enforce according to the Pope himself. Now let's take a look at these. Rudiger writes, they may legally have nurses and servants from among our people, and they may legally sell to Christians slaughtered meats, which they consider unfit for themselves according to the sanctity of their law. Christians may legally buy such meats. So you might remember from my video on medieval anti-Semitism that the main principle of the church's policies towards Jews was that they should be protected and not forcibly converted, but that they should also not be in positions of power over Christians. Generally, this meant it was not allowed for Jews to employ Christians in any way, but Rudiger says they can in his city. By this point, the church had also ruled that Christians should not be buying meat from Jews that the Jews consider not to be kosher. Generally, there are various parts of the animal Jews just don't eat, so they have no use for that meat. Jews often then sold these cuts they didn't want to Christians, sometimes at discount prices, but the church was offended by this, seeing the practice as Jews giving Christians second-rate meat. So while the official church position is that Jews shouldn't be selling their extra meat to Christians, Rudiger allows that too. So those aren't all of the provisions in this charter, but the ones I chose do a good job of illustrating my main point here. Jews were not viewed negatively all the time by their Christian neighbors, and for Rudiger, they are even viewed quite positively. Before we close out this first part of the video, let's look at how Rudiger concludes this document. He writes, if one of my successors dares to deny this grant and concession and force them to a greater tax, claiming that the Jews themselves usurped this status and did not receive it from the bishop, I have given them this charter of the aforesaid grant as proper testimony. In order that the meaning of this matter remains forever, I have strengthened this charter by signing it and imprinting it with my seal. Rudiger believes so strongly that Jews should be welcome and receive the privileges he granted them, that he does everything he can to make sure it would continue to remain that way, even after he's died. And that's a pretty big deal. A quick postscript about the Jews who accepted Rudiger's offer and settled in Spire. About a decade after this charter in 1096, the Jews of Spire would be one of the communities attacked by an angry mob that had its religious zeal stirred up by the call for the First Crusade. If you want to know more in general about this specific outbreak of violence, I do talk about it in the anti-Semitism video. For our purposes, today, what matters is that this mob came from outside the city, and the bishop of Spire at the time was a man named John, Rudiger's successor. He did what he could to protect the Jews, even bringing them into his palace. 12 Jews in that city were killed, and this event was horrific for the Jewish community. But it is important to note that it didn't mean the end for the Jewish community of Spire. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. The norm established by Rudiger's charter was disrupted, and the death of 12 Jews at the hands of religious fanatics was absolutely terrible. But things returned to normal after these outsiders left the city. In fact, the Jewish community in the Rhineland would largely go on to flourish for many centuries. Now that we've discussed Rudiger's charter to the Jews, a document that is but one of many similar charters that Jews in medieval Europe were offered, let's transition to talking about art. Now, if Jews and Christians really hated each other everywhere and all the time in the Middle Ages, we would not have countless examples of Jews acting as patrons for art produced by Christians, and vice versa. Much of what I'm talking about here comes from a great book by Joseph Schatzmiller called Cultural Exchange: Jews, Christians, and Art in the Medieval Marketplace. And if this brief discussion of the topic sparks an interest for you, I'd recommend starting there, as I'm providing only a few examples of the many that are presented in the book. So there are two main ways we know that Jews and Christians patronize someone of a different faith to produce art for them. The first of these is purely documentary. Especially near the end of the Middle Ages, we start to have very good record keeping and the birth of notaries, so we sometimes have contracts between two parties that indicate this religious difference. We also have a few different passing references to this happening in the early Middle Ages. For example, the earliest reference we have of Christians making art for Jews comes from 1152, when the rabbi of Regensburg noted in a letter to a colleague that the community had hired Christian artists to put stained glass windows in their synagogue. Before the rise of notaries in the later Middle Ages, these types of documents are few and far between, but Regensburg's example is very likely not that unusual. There are probably many other cases we just don't know about, and that brings us to the second way we know that Christians produced art for Jewish patrons. And that's when we look in a Jewish book and find mistakes that only a Christian artist would have made when creating art for Jewish patrons, as some of the things that appear in this art don't make sense in a Jewish context. But I'm kind of glad we have these mistakes to look at, as it is one of the more humorous ways we can learn about these types of interfaith patron-artist relationships. So let's look at some of these mistakes that indicate these types of arrangements. Most often we find examples of this in books. Frequently, Jews turn to Christians for figural art, especially in illuminated manuscripts. An illuminated manuscript is just a fancy way of saying illustrated manuscript. So why did Jews turn to Christians so often for figural art? Well, it's because Jews were generally less inclined to make figural art in the Middle Ages. Throughout Jewish history, there's sort of a back and forth between the idea that figural art shouldn't be created because of the commandment against graven images, and the idea that it's okay for there to be figural art. And that ongoing sort of back and forth argument did generally mean that Christian artists were the better choice for making this kind of art. So many Jews turned to Christians when they wanted to get a book illuminated. And typically, the books these Christians are illuminating are religious books. And that's something we're going to continue to see in this section of the video. Jews and Christians trusted one another enough that they would leave their important sacred objects with people of the other faith to work on. Alright, let's look now at a few of these examples of mistakes that indicate that there was probably a Christian artist. So the first of these mistakes I want to look at comes from a manuscript that today we call the Kaufman Haggadah, which dates to around 1300 and comes from somewhere in the Holy Roman Empire. A Haggadah is the text that Jews read from during the services for the holiday of Passover, and it's thus a very important religious book. The Kaufman name attached to it is the name of the family who were the longtime owners of the book in more recent times, and not the name of the family who originally owned it. Anyway, here's a page from that Haggadah where the artist has illustrated people sitting underneath the Hebrew word hallelujah, and they appear to be sitting as if they're in the synagogue. The problem here? The image depicts a Jewish man and woman sitting side by side, something that never happened in medieval synagogues, as Jewish men and women had different seating areas. With this type of mistake, I often wonder what the ultimate reaction of the Jewish patrons was. Did they just use the book anyway because it's so beautiful? Did the artist give them a discount because of the mistake? Obviously, they didn't destroy the image or have it redone, but that could also just mean they never used it. Who knows for sure? But this mistake comes as a result of Christian ignorance about Judaism, something that would not be a problem for a Jewish artist. Let's move to another example from the Holy Roman Empire from around 1300, this time an illuminated Bible we call the Schocken Bible. Each book of this Bible has a beautiful frontispiece like this one, with the name of the book and various scenes from that book. The one you see here is for Bereshit, or Genesis, and there is one medallion in particular that interests us. This illustration depicts Esau hunting, as he is described to do in the book of Genesis, and he is bringing home his kill. The problem here? He's depicted bringing a rabbit home, an animal that is not kosher. Again, the Christian artist here's ignorance of Jewish culture led to a pretty silly mistake. The last mistake I want to look at is probably my favorite, and it dates to around 1250, and it comes from a Machzor. This is a book that is read during the holiest Jewish holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Here, the problem isn't a mistake that depicts something that is taboo in Jewish culture, so at least there's that, but there's still a pretty huge mistake here. The artist who did the illustration here obviously didn't know Hebrew, and he wasn't sure which side of the page was up, and as a result, he actually put the scene of a stag being hunted upside down. You have to flip the page entirely to really be able to tell what's going on in the illustration. So in this case, a complete ignorance of Hebrew led to the mistake. So these mistakes tell us that Jews entrusted Christian artists with some of their holy books. Just in these examples, we saw a Haggadah, a Bible, and a Machzor. Jews wouldn't be hiring Christians like this or trusting them with these texts if their relationships were purely antagonistic, and that's because they weren't. Now that we've looked at several examples of Jews entrusting Christians with their holiest texts, let's look at the opposite. Christians trusting Jews to perform work on their religious objects. As I noted, Jews generally were not doing figural art in the Middle Ages, but there were two services provided by Jewish craftsmen and Christians that were often utilized. The first of these was bookbinding. Most Jewish boys received education and were literate, and one of the things they often learned as part of their training was bookbinding, so that they could put together their own books. Some Jews really excelled at this, to the point that their abilities became sought after outside of their own community. The most famous medieval Jewish bookbinder was Meir Jaffa of Regensburg, who bound dozens of Bibles for Christians in the city, and even incised his name, in Hebrew, on the spine of some of these books. Meir is the one example we have where we know unequivocally that he bound books, because he signed most of his books. But there are hundreds of other books throughout Europe that, based on how they were bound, were probably also done by Jewish bookbinders. And by the 15th century, Jewish bookbinders were so sought after that the Pope himself was employing Jewish bookbinders. And keep in mind, the books that are being bound here, all religious texts. Another area that Jews got involved in, especially in late medieval Italy and Sicily, was in jewelry making. There are hundreds of surviving contracts that come from two Sicilian brothers who had the surname Cuino, who were known for making coral jewelry. They actually dove to coral reefs themselves and harvested coral, and then they made jewelry out of it. One way or another, they ended up actually making coral rosaries, of all things. These are devotional items that are utilized in Catholicism to help remember various components of prayers. While the jewelry-making career of these two Jewish brothers is well documented from contracts and receipts, we aren't entirely sure how they came upon this endeavor. It could be that they were approached by Christians who liked their other work and asked for rosaries, or it may have been something they arrived at on their own. Either way, their coral rosaries became a huge hit, to the point that they ended up establishing contacts throughout Europe who were commissioning them to make huge numbers of these rosaries, as in hundreds of pounds of them, as is seen in some contracts. These rosaries, which were made by Jews, took Europe by storm and were used devotionally by hundreds, if not thousands, of Christians. So, medieval Jews and Christians trusted each other with their most important religious objects and even sought one another out for various projects when the expertise of people from the other faith was just considered to be better. These types of arrangements would have been impossible in a world where medieval Jews and Christians hated each other all the time. So that brings us to the last topic I want to address in this video, and that is the relationships that existed between medieval Jewish and Christian women. For this section of the video, I'm relying heavily on a book by Elisheva Baumgarten called Practicing Piety in Medieval Ashkenaz. One of her major arguments in this book is that, on average, medieval Jewish and Christian women had closer, more intimate relationships with one another than their male counterparts, and she provides several examples of this, which I'll now relate to you. One big area where this was true ties in nicely with our discussion of Rudiger's contract. Remember, one of the privileges he granted to the Jews of Spire was that they could hire servants and nurses from among the Christians in the city. Medieval Jewish women often hired Christian women as wet nurses. This was something expressly forbidden by the church, but something that happened a lot, especially in northern France and the Holy Roman Empire. The concept of a wet nurse is perhaps a bit alien to us today, but it is basically a woman who's hired as a nanny who also happens to be lactating, so she can actually feed infants their breast milk. This is a very personal relationship to hire someone for, and certainly implies a great deal of trust. Jewish women entrusted their own children's well-being to Christian women who were in this line of work. You might be wondering why this was a common occurrence. Why didn't Jewish women just stay home and take care of the child? Well, the answer to that is, on average, Jewish women were more autonomous than their Christian counterparts. They worked outside the home frequently. For example, about a third of Jewish moneylenders in the Middle Ages were actually women. In fact, in a decent chunk of medieval Jewish marriages, women were the primary breadwinners, while their husband often spent more time studying, something that doesn't pay very well. Women are still the major breadwinners in many modern ultra-Orthodox communities. While not all Jewish women hired wet nurses, the ones who had particularly flourishing businesses and whose income was important for the family would continue working not long after giving birth. It was the Jewish mother's responsibility to interview and hire wet nurses, negotiate their salaries, and just in general interact with the wet nurse. Once the child was no longer in need of breast milk, these women would often continue as nannies. The way we know about some of the intimate details of relationships between medieval Jewish and Christian women is because husbands, both Jewish and Christian ones, sometimes expressed concern about these various practices. And that's one of the ways we know a lot about this practice of wet nursing. Oftentimes the fathers of these children would become concerned with the practice in general, worried that it would corrupt their children and or their wives, but most rabbis ruled that it was perfectly fine. But sometimes we get more specific concerns. For example, during the holiday of Purim, one Jewish woman decided to give gifts to her wet nurse. It is common to give gifts to the poor and needy during the holiday, but her husband argued that she should only be giving those gifts to poor Jews. But ultimately, the rabbi ruled in favor of the woman, saying it is allowed to give these gifts to any poor people and not just Jews. Other fathers became concerned because their wives seemed to enjoy spending time with and chatting with these wet nurses and nannies, but again, generally rabbis ruled in favor of these women, saying there's no crime in talking to someone. So that's one type of fairly intimate relationship between Jewish and Christian women, and one that expresses a certain degree of trust, but it's still a relationship between a boss and an employer. The other types of relationships I would like to look at are even more intimate and involve Jewish and Christian women clearly seeing each other as equals and as friends. These friendships likely often developed in communal spaces. In many medieval cities, there were generally communal ovens, wells, and laundry areas, and the tasks related to these areas were often performed by women of both faiths. It was probably in those places where women of both faiths first saw each other as acquaintances, but often developed genuine friendships with one another. One thing about these friendships that generated a lot of objections from husbands was Jewish women borrowing clothing from their Christian neighbors and vice versa. Husbands were concerned that such a practice could make their wives ritually impure. This is because Christian women did not immerse themselves in ritual baths or make themselves pure again following menstruation. If a woman was impure, a Jewish man who strictly observed these practices could not even touch her, and obviously that's a problem if you're her husband. In this case, rabbis much more frequently ruled that women shouldn't be doing it because of that risk, but we have about a half dozen examples of this question being asked, so it probably was a common practice. Another area where we see Jewish and Christian women often interacting is when it comes to giving advice to one another about pregnancy, parenting, and childbirth. Obviously, husbands were much less qualified to weigh in on these topics, and Jews and Christians who met in communal spaces likely frequently talked about these topics, as in both medieval Judaism and Christianity, childbirth was a central aspect of their lives. The intimate conversations these women had concerned both Jewish and Christian husbands, who said they were concerned the advice given by someone of another faith might somehow be taboo or lead to women violating religious obligations. Both Christian and Jewish authorities more or less ruled in the same way, saying that when it comes to these feminine issues, women are the greatest experts, regardless of their faith. In other words, the practice was considered acceptable. One of the more touching and detailed examples we have of one of these intimate relationships appears in a Jewish text called the Sefer Hasidim, or the Book of the Pious. This 13th century text dealt a lot with how Jews and Christians should interact with one another, what is accepted and what isn't, and it often uses short examples to get points across. One of the events that the author of the Sefer Hasidim relates is one where a young Jewish boy was run over by a horse cart. This happened in public, and the mother was there to witness this horrible event, and her son died. And a Christian woman who was there saw what happened and offered to help the mother immediately, relating to her that she lost one of her children at a young age, and the two of them talked about how hard it is to grieve a child. It's very likely that this intimate conversation between the two women ultimately resulted in a friendship. So, as we've seen in this video, Jews and Christians did not always hate one another, and Jews were not constantly persecuted by their Christian neighbors. As we saw in the example of Rudiger of Spire, Jews were sought after to help improve communities. As we saw in our discussion of art, Jews and Christians trusted one another with some of their most cherished sacred objects, and as we saw in our discussion of the relationships between Jewish and Christian women, Jewish women trusted their Christian nurses with the well-being of their children, and Jewish and Christian women often had close, intimate relationships with one another. None of that would be possible in a world where Jews always felt threatened, and Christians always wanted to persecute and kill their Jewish neighbors. Now remember, those persecutions absolutely did happen, as did massacres, but what we saw in this video was what the norm for medieval Jewish-Christian relations was, while the massacres and accusations against Jews were a disruption of this norm. That's it for this video. In next week's video, I'm going to do another top 10 list. Right now, I think the plan for this channel is to alternate between videos where I go super deep on a topic, like this one, and top 10 lists, which give more of a general overview about one topic or another. We talked a fair bit in this video about the daily lives of medieval women, and next week I'm going to give you my picks for the 10 most powerful medieval women. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see some of the other videos I've made, like the anti-Semitism video I mentioned a bunch of times in this video, you should see some of those videos on your screen now. Thanks for watching.